Amen. Well, you can read some parts of the Bible and you struggle to find the relevance. But the book of Job is not one of them. I don't need to introduce you to the topic of suffering. You're all familiar with it. Either you have suffered or someone close to you has suffered. And even if you haven't suffered, it's only a matter of time. Everyone suffers, to varying degrees, sure, but we all suffer. No other book of the Bible deals with the topic of suffering more than the book of Job. But perhaps surprisingly, it doesn't really answer the question we most want answered. Why? Why does God permit suffering? Why do innocent people suffer? You see, the book of Job is not God's textbook on suffering. It's more like a first aid manual or a survival guide. A survival guide doesn't explain why it snows. It tells you how to survive in the snow. A first aid manual doesn't tell you all the different ways that you can break your leg. It tells you what to do when you break your leg. Now, that's what the book of Job is. It's more practical than theoretical. Bryson Smith, the Presbyterian pastor and author, writes, Job doesn't give us an exhaustive catalogue of reasons as to why suffering happens. It's more concerned with how to act towards God when suffering happens. Job is a book about whether God is worth following, even when we suffer. How should I respond to suffering? That's really the question this book answers. How should I respond to suffering? And as I think about that, one of the most reassuring things is that the book of Job actually exists. Even before we had our first experience of suffering, either in our own lives or suffering we observed. Even before we'd begun to ask the question, why would God allow this? God had written the book of Job. So far from God avoiding our questions, far from God being distant and aloof in our pain, God gives us this book to challenge us, to encourage us to live with suffering, to build a framework so that we can deal with suffering and come out the other end still whole, still trusting God, humbled, grieving, subdued, in some ways reduced, but in other ways knowing more of God and of his world and his wisdom and his love. That's what I'm hoping this book will do. But we're not going to stop just in the book of Job. We have to get to Jesus. Because if we stop with Job, it would be like beginning a book but putting it back on the shelf before you read the final chapter. We might be able to accept that God is at work in our suffering, but we would never know the comfort and the hope and the perspective that Jesus provides to suffering. So, with those introductory comments, let's dive in. In our opening verses, we're introduced to a man called Job. There was a man. He lived in the land of Uz, which we don't know anything about. Sorry, if you were expecting to get a lesson on Uz. There is no town or region or country called Uz on any ancient map anywhere. We also don't know when he lived. We can make an educated guess based on some hints that in the book to do with language and practices, but that's all it is, it's a guess. It would certainly fit if Job lived around the time of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, maybe 2000 BC. And if he lived somewhere in the eastern part of the Middle East, maybe near modern-day Iraq or Iran. But in the end, it doesn't really matter. Here's what we do know. Most important of all, Job was blameless and upright. He feared God and he shunned evil. The narrator tells us that in verse 1. And it's not just his opinion, that is God's opinion as well. God repeats this description of Job in verse 8 of chapter 1 and in verse 3 of chapter 2. blameless and upright. It doesn't mean Job was perfect, but it means that he was a man who sought to obey God. It mattered to him what God thought. His decisions were based on what would please God. You can see that in his actions. His regular habit, verse 5, was to purify his kids and then offer a sacrifice for their sin. Not because they had sinned, but just in case they'd sinned. Job cared what God thought. The second crucial piece of information about him is that he was a great man. The end of verse 3 tells us that he was the greatest man among all the people of the East. He was great because in lots of areas his life was blessed. Verse 2, he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Verse 3, he had thousands of head of sheep, camels, oxen and donkeys. Someone asked at Bible study during the week, what would you do with 500 donkeys? The answer, I think, was that, well, he must have grown so much produce and had so many things that needed transporting. It was like having, a fleet of semi-trailers. In those days, when worth was measured by the size of your herds rather than the size of your investment portfolio, the description is that this guy was as wealthy as Elon Musk. He had a lot of servants. His children all got on well with one another. They would host parties and enjoy a feast together. This guy was blessed. Blessed with abundant, harmonious family, satisfying riches, significant influence. Blameless, upright and great. Now these are the opening verses that actually set the scene. If you like, they're the backstory. Because our story actually begins in verse 6 and our camera swings from earth up to heaven. And perhaps surprisingly, as it's described, heaven is a bit busier than we may have imagined. Rather than God sitting there all by himself, the picture is more of a king sitting on his throne in his throne room, but he's surrounded by his royal court, his advisors and his messengers and his servants. Have a look at verse 6. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan was also with them. It's likely that the angels were messengers who'd been carrying out tasks and they were reporting back. Now included among these angels was Satan, who's also a created being, who is less than God, who is reporting to God. There's lots we don't know, lots of questions we might have, but let's just stick with what we're told. He's actually called the Satan, which is a title. He is the accuser, or the adversary is what the word Satan means, the accuser or the adversary. You see, in the heavenly court, he's the one who plays the role of leader of the opposition. He's the original devil's advocate, who will put up a counter position to just oppose God. God asks him what he's been doing. Verse 7, he answers this and that, roaming around the earth. So God says, verse 8, did you happen to notice my servant Job in your travels? There's no one like him. He's blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil, which we already know. And the Satan, the accuser, plays his role perfectly. Verse 9, of course he fears you. Look how you've blessed him. He's playing the system. He knows how to get you to do what he wants. He does what you want. He's only a fair weather believer. He's following you because his life is good. Now, this is really what these opening chapters are about. Why you follow God. So let me ask you, why do you follow God? Or if you don't yet follow God, what are you hoping to gain if you were to follow God? That's the question. There are all sorts of good things that come from being a Christian. This is one of them, isn't it? You get to be with a church family who love and accept you and welcome you and encourage you and support you. And in your life, you get a new purpose and a satisfaction with life and a joy. Or more broadly in life, God has given you all sorts of general blessings, all sorts of good things. He's given you health and family and work, financial security and comfortable housing for many of us. Of all the reasons why you follow God, how much is it because he gives you these things? Or to flip the question around, what would you need to lose out of all these things for your faith to waver and for you to stop following God and for you to think he was not worth following? So these are the accusations that Satan brings against Job. Notice how it insults God. Satan is saying even the best of humanity will only follow God because of what they can get. He's saying that God himself is not worthy of obedience and love. He's saying that God has to pay for obedience and love. And Satan suggests a test to prove his point, verse 11. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. It seems a reasonable assumption. It's a fairly common, transactional view of human relationships. People think, if you give me what I want, I will give you what you want. Right up until the time when you stop. And then I'm out of here. We think that way about marriage, about work, churches, hobbies, clubs, friends. So why not our relationship with God? I'd say it's a fairly accurate observation about human nature. But verse 12, remarkably, confusingly, God agrees. Very well then, everything he has is in your hands, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. Everything around Job is fair game, says God, but you can't touch Job himself. Now, notice Satan can only do what God permits and no more. It's Satan's hand which acts, but he is God's Satan. God is in charge. God is making decisions. And so Satan goes to work. Verse 13 to 15, we're back on earth. A servant delivers terrible news to Job. The oxen and donkeys have been stolen by the Sabaeans, and the servant's killed, and I'm the only one who escaped. Then while the servant was still speaking, verse 16, another servant came and announced, God's fire fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I'm the only one who escaped. And then while the second servant was still speaking, servant 3 arrives, verse 17. The Chaldeans took the camels and killed the servants, and I'm the only one who escaped. And then finally, verse 18, while servant 3 is still speaking, servant 4 arrives with the worst news of all your sons and daughters have been killed. A mighty wind caused the roof to collapse on them, and I'm the only one who escaped. Now, that is the parent's worst nightmare, isn't it? To outlive your child. To bury your children in the ground. And Job loses 10, all on one tragic day. And as the servants are standing there waiting to be dismissed, verse 20, Job got up, tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Job doesn't curse God. He mourns absolute despair and misery. Who wouldn't? But he falls on the ground and worships God. And even though we are told that it comes from Satan's hand, Job recognises that ultimately it's God who has taken it all away, because he's the one on the throne. And yet he still praises the name of the Lord. Job's argument is that he would be a hypocrite to accept good things from God and then complain when they're taken away. He understands that in a sense he hasn't actually lost anything, because he started with nothing and that's what he's got now. And so Satan loses. He was wrong. He was sure Job would curse God, but instead Job praises God. Why does Job follow God? For God's sake. Because God is worthy and true, and he deserves our honour and our obedience, not because of what Job has received. And the narrator gives his summary, just in case we'd missed it, verse 22. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. In the last month or so, as you may be aware, out-of-control wildfires, bushfires, have destroyed thousands of homes in California, including the Malibu home of Australian actor and director Mel Gibson. He's a well-known Catholic. I'm not suggesting he's anything like Job, but here was his reaction. I've been relieved from the burden of my stuff because it's all in cinders. God gives, God takes. We come in with nothing, that's the way we go out. Here's the deal, you'll always be okay if you seek first the kingdom of God. Look at the flowers of the field, look at the birds of the air. They get fed, they get clothed. Now that's Job's attitude. A little later, we're going to have the opportunity to sing something similar from when we sing Blessed or Blessed Be Your Name. We're going to sing this. Blessed be your name when the sun is shining down on me, when the world's all as it should be. Blessed be your name. It's easy to praise God when things are going well. Blessed be your name on the road marked with suffering, though there's pain in the offering. Blessed be your name. You give and you take away. You give and you take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. Now, may we sing those words and mean them. Well, Satan is down, but he's not out. He comes back for round 2. We're into chapter 2. The scene is the same as chapter 1. We're back up in heaven. The angels are presenting themselves before God, and Satan is there as well. And verse 2, God asks him where he's come from, and Satan answers here and there, roaming around the earth, just like in chapter 1. But look at God's reply, verse 3. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil, and he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. Now, firstly, notice the tone. What is the tone of this? Is there an element of taunting here from God? Have you considered my servant Job? He still maintains his integrity, you know. But I wonder if there's also pride in Job, God's pride in Job. Is there a pleasure in seeing that Job has stood firm? Have you considered my servant Job? He's lost everything, but he's still following me. Notice too how this describes who is responsible for Job's suffering. Satan incited God against Job. Now, we've probably got all sorts of questions about what exactly does that mean. In chapter 1, it said that God authorises Satan to act. Now, somehow this is two different ways of describing the same thing. We'll consider these questions more in the weeks to come. You know, who is responsible? So just hold on to that description. Thirdly, notice that God has acted without reason. Job didn't deserve what he received, and this is important. That's information that we readers have, but Job doesn't have. And he puzzles over this for 30 chapters. What have I done? I didn't deserve it. You are just. Why am I receiving this? We get to know. And Satan responds, chapter 2, verse 4, skin for skin. Now, I've got about 10 commentaries on Job at the moment, and they nearly all say, we don't really know what this means. So here's my guess. Skin for skin. I think it means something like a man will do almost anything to avoid damage to his own person, to his own skin. That's what's really valuable. His skin is the most valuable thing to him. He doesn't mind losing everything else, but, his own body is what he values. I think that's what it means. Verse 5, but stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, then he will curse you. And God responds again, verse 6, he gives Job into Satan's hand, but once again there's the limiting factor, he can't take Job's life. And so, verse 7, Satan heads back to earth and inflicts Job with terrible sores all over his body, from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. And he's in such pain and such itching. Just think the worst case of German measles that you can think of, and you just don't scratch them. And he gets out this broken pottery and scratches the sores. And there he is, all alone, his children gone, sitting in the ash heap at the city rubbish dump. Can things get any worse? Well, yes, they can, because Job's wife makes her only appearance in the book. She gets one verse. Verse 9, are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. Now, maintaining his integrity is exactly what God commended him for in chapter 1. And cursing God was just what he hadn't done in chapter 1. He'd praised God. His wife is Satan's tool. She is tempting Job to do exactly what Satan hopes he will do. Maybe Satan knew what he was doing when he didn't include Job's wife in the original destruction of the family, when he took the children but left the wife. She is saying, what has all your obedience, what has all your suffering, and what has all your offering sacrifices actually achieved for you? Nothing. You kept your side of the bargain, but God didn't keep his. God has shown his true colours. Now you should show your true colours. That's what she's saying. God didn't maintain his side of the bargain, and so you're set free from yours. And once again, Job responds with integrity. Verse 10, you're speaking like a fool. Now, foolishness and wisdom, it's another theme that we'll see coming up as we work through Job. So foolish advice has come from his wife. Verse 10, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? It's pretty similar, really, to his response in chapter 1, isn't it? The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. In other words, he's saying you have to accept both when you trust God. You have to accept good and you also have to accept trouble. Both of those are what it means to trust God. God is the author of everything. He is worthy of our worship in the bad times as well as in the good times. And Job will follow God even when God brings trouble. So we come back to this question, why do you follow God? And then once again the narrator gives his summary. In all this Job did not sin in what he said. And here in verse 10 of chapter 2, God wins and Satan loses, and that's the end of Satan. at least in the book of Job. So what can we learn? Firstly, trusting God through suffering shows that God is worthy. Trusting God through suffering shows that God is worthy. Satan implied that God was unworthy of worship, that people would only worship him because of what they get. And yet Job's response of trusting God through his suffering showed that God is worthy. He's always worthy of our worship, whatever he brings us. And so God is actually glorified, and he's shown to be worthy of our worship. And so when you suffer, and when you keep following God through it, God is glorified. He is shown to be worthy of worship, maybe even more than when you follow God when your life is good. You see, people are watching you. For Job, it was his servants and it was his wife who were watching. What will they see as they watch you suffer? I'm not suggesting that you put on a fake mask. Job certainly didn't. I'm not suggesting that you pretend to feel things that you don't actually feel or say things you don't mean. But even as you weep and despair and question, you can look to God as the only one who is worthy of your trust. You can be an incredible testimony for God's goodness and sufficiency, even more when life hurts than when life is good. In fact, God can even use the suffering to focus our trust on him. As all the other things in our life get burned away, all the other things that we depend on, we are left with only one thing, one solid and steadfast foundation, one worthy object. We've been considering 1 Peter a little bit in our last series, and that's exactly what 1 Peter teaches us. 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 6. In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These trials have come so that your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may be proved genuine and may result in praise, glory and honour. Now what that's saying, we've talked about how it's a little complicated in the grammar, but it's saying that when you suffer trials and when you lose wealth, when you lose family, when you lose your health, when you lose your respect, all of these things you've relied on, when you lose those things, it will teach you to rely on God alone. It removes all those other things, and all that's left is a trust in God that is pure. And so in all of that, God is glorified. And as we seek to show God worthy, there's one other lesson I think I want to highlight today, and that is that God is watching. God is watching. He's pleased when we choose to follow him despite suffering. I was struck by God's comment to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Now that's us too, I'd like to think. We may not be blameless and upright like Job, and yet when we stand up for what is right, when we don't give in to temptation and unbelief, especially in the face of pain and confusion and loss, when we do those things, then God is a proud father who loves to see his children clinging onto him. Why does God tell us to pray? Well, I think one of the reasons is because he loves to hear us. He knows what he's going to do, and yet he loves to hear us pray and depend on him. He boasted about God. About Job. "Have you considered my servant Job?" And he's watching. He loves to hear us sing. In Rock of Ages, His oath, his covenant, his blood support me in the whelming flood, when every earthly prop gives way. He then is still my strength and stay. He loves to hear us say, along with Job, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Let's pray.